Welcome to 5 Things to Fix. I'm Peter from Birds of Play, and together we're gonna take a hard look at Final Fantasy XIII and how it could have been made even better. Final Fantasy XIII is considered by many to be the black sheep of the Final Fantasy family, while at the same time being much beloved, even if that love isn't always easy to talk about, especially since jumping on the bandwagon of hate is always so popular. Love it or hate it, it's here to stay. But what if things had turned out differently? I want you to imagine, if you will, a world in which the launch of Final Fantasy XIII was considered a great success and hailed as an instant classic. I'll do my very best to take you there. If you end up liking the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Join the birdhouse, y'all! Join the nest? No, birdhouse! And tell us about some of your fixes in the comments down below. But enough of that. Let's capture lightning in a bottle. Fix number 1. Guns for everyone! The opening of Final Fantasy XIII has often been criticized, along with other things about the game, for dropping the player in an unfamiliar world filled with exotic terminology. Contrary to popular opinion, however, I think the game has a really strong opening. Final Fantasy XIII's initial reception was plagued by unmet expectations. After all, it was the first truly next-gen Final Fantasy title at the time. Surely it would be almost twice as good as Final Fantasy VII, cause 2 times 7 is 14, which is almost 13. Anyways, once I let go of the hype machine and my preconceived notions, I started to appreciate the game for what it really was. It can be a real joy to gradually uncover the mysteries of this fantastic new world, even if you sometimes feel like the third wheel for not knowing what's going on. However, one thing I wish the opening had was more guns. I'm usually not a big fan of guns, but in this case they seem appropriate. Especially since the majority of the party hasn't yet awakened to their powers as l'Cie. In the first 2 chapters of the game, only Vanille is already a l'Cie, as is hinted at by her 3rd ATB gauge already being unlocked from the start. Spoilers, I guess. This means that Vanille wielding some weird antlers with strings as a weapon can be excused in the long run. However, Snow running around punching fully armed forces and Hope pulling out a comically large pocket boomerang to slay monsters doesn't make much sense. At least not at this point in the story. Especially since everyone else is running around them literally shooting assault rifles all over the place. Therefore, temporarily arming Snow and Hope with guns would emphasize their very human frailty, while at the same time making their transition into l'Cie even more impactful. It's called contrast, people, and it's a good thing. Instead, Snow goes from a guy who brings fists to a gunfight to, well, a guy who brings fists to a gunfight. Now show me those guns, Snow. That's right. Fix number 2.
Ravage me.
While the game has been criticized for being overly linear, the battle system has come under attack for being semi-automatic. This is, however, not a totally accurate criticism, since in the long run the battle system of Final Fantasy XIII does prove itself to be both thrilling and thought-provoking at times, even though this does in no way apply to every battle. Go Snow, go! Go Snow, go! Go Snow, go! And a lot could be done in order to make every fight a more interesting encounter. This innovative new system is, however, very likely to leave a bad first impression, since the player spends the first 2 chapters of the game getting accustomed to a system that seems to mostly consist of pushing the same button again and again without much thought. The game itself choosing which actions are most appropriate for each situation. The first 2 chapters, therefore, present a very limited view of the potential of the system, spending a lot of time to teach the player very little. This is especially frustrating, since at this point of the game, you don't even have access to the Crystarium yet to level up your characters, giving you very little to actually do. Not having access to the Crystarium makes sense, considering that the character is still human. But one thing you do have access to are at least 2 different classes, namely the Commando and Ravager. The game just doesn't tell you. So, in order to stave off that feeling at the beginning of just walking through linear corridors and fighting semi-automatic battles, I suggest removing the training wheels a little bit sooner. teaching us to perform paradigm shifts a bit earlier, letting us use the Commando and the Ravager classes to deliberately stagger enemies. This would help mitigate that bad first impression many get at the start of the game, and prepare us for when we unlock more classes later on. Don't just command me, ravage me. Fix number 3. Information underload. Final Fantasy XIII presents a wonderfully imaginative world that often challenges our preconceptions of not only what a Final Fantasy game is, but also what we can expect from mainstream sci-fi and fantasy. Furthermore, the structure and the power dynamics of the world are directly tied into a fascinating mythological tale, the main story only being a small part of a much grander narrative of cosmic proportions. As part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis series of games, Final Fantasy XIII was based on and expanded on a common mythos. But even though the story has its origin in this mythic tale, only a fraction of this mythos can be said to be featured front and center in Final Fantasy XIII. Even though I can appreciate some exotic terminology in the opening of the game, a part of the fun is eventually to uncover its secrets. This makes me think that the game actually could use a Bugenhagen moment. You know, like the one from Final Fantasy VII, where Bugenhagen explained how the livestream works. Go Bugenhagen, go! Go Bugenhagen, go! Go Bugenhagen, go! We kinda get something similar when Sash and Vanille visit Nautilus, the city of dreams, and see a spectacular retelling of how Cocoon was saved from the same threat the party now poses. In a similar way, it would have been great to get a good old-fashioned info dump, telling us all about Pulse, Etro, and Lindsay, and for what purpose they were created. In addition to giving us more context for the events of Final Fantasy XIII itself, this would also serve to prepare the player better for the events of Final Fantasy XIII too. And who doesn't want to be well prepared for Final Fantasy XIII too? Damn, Caius is sexy. Fix number 4. Waste of space. The Crystarium is Final Fantasy XIII's version of a leveling system, being somewhat reminiscent of the sphere grid from Final Fantasy X, but not really. I like the sphere grid a lot more for one. Much like the battle system and the game in general, the Crystarium could be accused of being overly linear, maybe even to the extent that it might just as well be an automatic process. However, I'm not here to talk about the structure of the Crystarium from a gameplay perspective, even though I think it could have been made a lot more interesting. Instead, I would like to talk about the design itself. As things are, there's nothing inherently wrong with how the Crystarium looks, aside from it being a bit bland. But the problem I see isn't strictly about what's there, but rather what isn't. In a game brimming with unexplored lore, every nook and cranny of the interface presents an opportunity to draw us further into the world of the game. Seeing as the Crystarium is a part of the menu the players intended to visit quite frequently, it's prime real estate that goes a bit to waste in its current state. What I would like to see would be the Crystarium representing a sort of microcosm of Final Fantasy XIII's mythology. One way to implement this would be to have different parts of the Crystarium allude to different deities, letting players gradually uncover the pantheon of Fabula Nova Crystallis as they progress through its different branches. In addition to helping the player get to grips with the underlying mythos of Final Fantasy XIII, this would also further establish the party's power as something of divine origin, reminding us that we are but pawns in a far greater game. Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX is a great game. Fix number 5. Backtracking. As a general rule, especially for the older titles, I try not to talk too much about the classic faults people have found with the game. The reason is that most of them have been done to death. And since the purpose of these videos is, at least hypothetically, to try and shed light on the Final Fantasy series in new and interesting ways, I try to stay away from the low-hanging fruit. I am a generous god. Now that we come to the last fix for Final Fantasy XIII, however, I can't help myself from wanting to show some love to the shoe puff in the room. The shoe puff, of course, being the game's much criticized linearity. But what is to be done? Well, Even if most of Final Fantasy XIII is basically one big beautiful corridor, the thing that always bothered me wasn't the linear nature of the game per se, but rather the fact that we can't go back and revisit certain locations. As we reach Pulse, the world famously opens up a bit, but I never really felt that did the trick. There just wasn't enough to do, and hunts have never really been my thing personally. I don't mind hunts, but they usually need to have a good story associated with them in order to get me invested. Remember that elusive rare level 99 red chocobo from Final Fantasy XII? Yeah. Fuck that guy. So if we can't have proper sidetracking, with more to do than just hunting, I wish we could at least have proper backtracking. See what I did there? Go Peter, go! Go Peter, go! Go Peter, go! I know that there might be story reasons as to why we can't go back, but truth be told, it would be just as easy to conjure up an excuse as to why we would be able to go back and forth, especially late in the game. Maybe this has something to do with how the game was released on 3 separate DVDs for the Xbox 360 back in the day, as opposed to a single Blu-ray disc for the PlayStation 3. But no matter the reason, I wish I could go back, even if it was just to hunt. What does this game lack? The ability to go back.
Hey everyone, this is Nökwi, the boring one. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a comment down below telling us about some of your fixes. Also, tell us about some birds in your country.
So boring.
Bird sounds. That was fun, right? I'm fun.
No, brother. You are naturally boring.